Okay, so I'm back with another cosmological argument that is not exactly well known and not exactly talked about 24/7. Here I'm referencing a paper by Christoph Gregory Weaver called simply Yet Another Cosmological Argument, which is actually quite fascinating because it runs on a rather modest causal principle and is based on eternalism slash four-dimensionalism, which makes it actually quite unique when compared to other such arguments that either favor presentism or are relatively neutral regarding the issue. So in order to do the groundwork, let's start with a definitive sense of contingency that Weaver has in mind for his argument. He stipulates that there are complex purely contingent facts that are mereological fusions of simple purely contingent facts, which means there are conglomerates of micro-contingencies that make up macro-contingencies, in the sense of micro-entities constituting macro-entities. Additionally then, there would be something like the sum of all purely contingent facts, simply the whole exhaustive set of all purely contingent entities. Let us call it the maximal purely contingent fact. So what we are getting at here can be properly understood as something like the purely contingent parts principle, PCPP. For any entity x, if there are some y's such that x is composed solely of y's and the y's are purely contingent, then x is also purely contingent. So whatever macro fact is composed of nothing but facts that themselves are purely contingent is going to be purely contingent itself. So if we compose a maximal purely contingent fact, this fact is going to be purely contingent itself. So then the argument is going to employ a modest causal principle that is going to be used with respect to a maximal purely contingent fact. Let us call a maximal purely contingent fact W so that we won't get confused later on. With this in mind, we can start a rundown of the premises. 1. For any entity x, if x is a purely contingent fact, then possibly there is at least one entity y such that y causally produced x. That just means that whatever is purely contingent possibly has a cause, not necessarily, just possibly. We shall later on strengthen this principle as it itself entails a stronger version that will be derived as a part of the argument. So we can come to 2. W, our maximal purely contingent fact, is a purely contingent fact. So it sounds silly and it's just conceptually true. We define W as the sum of all purely contingent facts, and following our purely contingent parts principle, we could state that indeed W is purely contingent. So we come to 3. If there is at least one entity y such that y causally produced W, then there is a Z such that it is concrete and Z exists necessarily. So since W just is the sum of all purely contingent reality and therefore itself purely contingent, the realm of contingency is exhausted. So whatever might be the ground of the cause of W will surely have to be non-contingent, i.e. necessary, and since it grounds the causal origin, it will also be a concrete entity. So 4. For any entity x, if x is a purely contingent fact, then there is at least one entity y such that y causally produced x. So this is the stronger version of premise 1 derived from this premise itself. I am going to give a valid argument for this deduction later on, but before I'll do so, we're going to get through the argument. So the point here is that whatever counts as purely contingent does have a causal origin. In other words, if something is purely contingent, then there is some cause of it. Therefore it follows 5. If W is a purely contingent fact, then there is at least one entity y such that y causally produced W. And from this we get 6. There is at least one entity y such that y causally produced W. And now from 3 and from 6 we get 7. Therefore there is a Z such that it is concrete and it exists necessarily. So notice that y is the cause of W, not Z. Z is only the ground of y's existence, in the sense that Z exists if y exists, which means the cause of W here can be contingent, even though not wholly contingent, while the ground of this cause is of course a concrete necessary being. This has the advantage that the necessary being in question and the cause of W are not identical in the modal sense, so as say God can of course be a necessary being, God's act of creation Y can still be contingent. So now, how do we make the inference from 1 to 4? From 1, for any entity x, if x is a purely contingent fact, then possibly there is at least one entity y such that y causally produced x, to 4, for any entity x, if x is a purely contingent fact, then there is at least one entity y such that y causally produced x. So let me just give an argument that leads us from 1 to 4 by some very general principles. First, some abbreviations. Px means x is a purely contingent fact, and Rxy means x causally produced y. Additionally, we need a would operator which stands for if P were to hold, Q would hold, and a might operator that states if P were to hold, Q might hold. So here we have premise 1, and premise 1 can be read as if y brought about x, then if there were no cause for x, x wouldn't be purely contingent. Now premise 2 can be read as if x is purely contingent, then possibly there is some y that brought about x. Premise 3 states that what is purely contingent is necessarily purely contingent, meaning that it's a conceptual question. Such entities are by their nature purely contingent and couldn't be different. But now, how does this get us to 4? If x is purely contingent, then there is some y such that y brought about x. Well, let's look at premise 2. It states that, so formulated, that if x were purely contingent, it might hold that x was brought about by y. We can express this using our might operator. But now, using the inference from premise 1, we get the following, which reads as, if x were purely contingent, it might hold that x was brought about by y, in which case it holds that if there were no cause for x, it holds that x could not be purely contingent. Okay, I know that sounds silly, but look at this. This can be abbreviated to, if x were purely contingent, then it might hold that x is not purely contingent. But premise 3 obviously stated that what is purely contingent is necessarily purely contingent, so the inference is wrong. And the inference is derived from the modality in premise 1 stating that possibly there is no cause for x. Well, what this means is that it's not possible that there might be no cause for x. So when we formulate premise 2 in the following way, then we can do away with the latter part, and as a result we get this, which just is our premise 4. And with our premise 4, the argument can run as I've shown. So, bravo. And by the way, you're welcome.